I'm going to turn on some study music. And I'm going to review my study guide. And whatever I don't know, I'm going to have to review. So basically, I'm going to quiz myself. So, how can we determine abnormal versus normal psychology or behavior? Hold on, study guide review. So abnormal psychological behavior is going to have what we refer to in psychology as the 4 Ds, and that is going to distress the individual that it's happening to. It's going to create dysfunction in their life. It's going to create deviance, so social deviance, and it's going to be dangerous for them. So that's the difference. So it's asking, at what point do you draw the line between someone who has a psychological disorder and someone who's got an adjustment disorder? Is it even necessary to diagnose? So questions about normality and abnormality are actually basic to understanding psychological disorders. Let's see. Psychological disorders are part of the human experience, directly or indirectly touching the life of every person, which is true. These disorders and the people who, as you read about these disorders and the people who suffer from them, you'll find that these problems can be treated if not prevented, which is really nice to know. So, psychological disorders impact the individual and the people around them, but let's start defining what abnormality is when it comes to abnormal behaviors. There's a range of behavior that people consider to be normal, but where do we draw the line? I'm going to read some situations to you, and you guys write in the comments if you think that they are abnormal, okay? Feeling jinxed when your lucky seat in an exam is already occupied when you get to class. Is that normal? Is that abnormal? What about being unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to study, unable to talk to anyone else for days after your boyfriend says it's over? Is that normal or is that abnormal? What about if you break into a cold sweat at just the thought of being stuck in an elevator? Is that normal, friends, or is it abnormal? What about refusing to eat solid food for days at a time in order to stay thin? So there's a bunch of these behaviors that we're like, oh, it's not normal, but also, like, is it a disorder, you know? If you're like most people, you probably found it surprisingly difficult to decide which of these behaviors are normal and which are abnormal. So many are part of our daily life, right? Like having a diet, for example. You may want to be on a, what's it called? Like a juice cleanse and not have solids for days. Does that mean it's abnormal? It depends on the context, okay? So criteria exists so that we can provide appropriate treatment to working with clients. If you look back at this list of behaviors that I read to you, how would you rate each of the applied in the 5 criteria for a psychological disorder that mental health professionals use? In reality, no one would diagnose a psychological disorder on the basis of just a single behavior, okay? But using criteria from the DSM-5 can at least help give some insight into the process that clinicians will use to decide whether a client has a disorder or not. The first criteria for a psychological disorder is clinical significance, meaning that the behavior includes a measurable degree of impairment that a clinician can observe, okay? So people who feel jinxed about not having a lucky seat available for this exam, they would fit the criteria if they weren't able to take the exam, study for the exam at all, unless they sat in the seat and this happened every single time for the exam, right? Because then that would be affecting their life. It would be impairing their life. And secondly, to be considered evidence of a psychological disorder, a behavior must reflect a dysfunction in a psychological, biological, or developmental process. So even if researchers don't know the cause of the dysfunction, they at least assume that one day they'll be able to figure it out, okay? So the third criteria for abnormality, okay, so first criteria for a psychological disorder is it's significant. It's clinically significant. The second criteria for an abnormal behavior, not a psychological disorder, abnormal behavior is dysfunction. The third criteria for abnormality is that the behavior must be associated with significant distress or disability in important realms of life. So distress. Okay? That sounds similar to clinical significance, but what distinguishes distress or disability, so it could be distress or disability, is that it applies to the way that the individual feels or behaves beyond a measurable effect that the clinician can observe. The individual either feels negatively affected by the behavior, which would be distress, or suffers negative consequences in life as a result of the disability. Sad. So, feels negatively affected or suffers negative consequences. That's so horrible, you guys. It's true. Like, I have ADHD, right? It is a disorder. And people say funny things like, oh, squirrel. It literally, like, you're literally suffering because of the way that it impacts your life. And fourth, the individual's behavior. Okay. People may enjoy playing video games to a point, but if they exclude their other obligations, that'll negatively affect their lives. And they also might not be able to stop themselves from engaging in this behavior. Fourthly, the individual's behavior cannot simply be socially deviant as defined in terms of religion, politics, or sexuality. The person who refuses to eat meat for ideological reasons would not be considered to have a psychological disorder. However, if that person restricts all food intake to the point that his or her health is in jeopardy, where was I? Then that individual may meet one of the criteria for abnormality, such as clinical significance and or distress/disability dimension. So it has to be socially deviant. Let's see. Socially deviant to the point where it's affecting their health. Okay? Because that's not normal. The fifth and final criteria for a psychological disorder is that it reflects a dysfunction within the individual. Okay, so dysfunction in psychological, biological, or developmental process. For example, I have ADHD. I have executive function. It's a developmental dysfunction. Okay, so a psychological disorder cannot reflect a difference in political beliefs between citizens and their governments. Let's see. That's weird. So, clinical significance. Okay, clinical significance. Clinician can see the impairment. Okay, for a psychological disorder. The second is that the behavior reflects a psychological, biological, or developmental disorder. Meaning that researchers feel that one day they can discover the cause. The third criteria for abnormality is that the behavior must be associated with significant distress or disability, meaning that the individual feels negatively affected or they suffer negative consequences in their life as a result of the disability. Okay? So the way my professor taught it to us is 4Ds, like meaning dysfunction, danger, deviant, and distress. So distress is the one where you feel bad, okay? Deviant is the one where it puts you in jeopardy. Is that? And the fifth, so danger, which one is danger? Socially deviant. I feel like a danger is socially deviant. Anyway, so dysfunction, it could be in psychological, biological, or cognitive dysfunction. So, and it has to be a dysfunction within the person, not a dysfunction with like political dysfunction or something like that. Where's my poster? Oh, there it is. Okay, so what else is on my study guide? The basics of the biopsychosocial approach. Let's see. What causes abnormal behavior? So the biopsychosocial perspective is a model in which the interaction of biological, psychosocial, and sociocultural factors is seen as influencing the development of the individual over time. Okay, so what is social, that is such a long word. Biopsychosocial perspective is how bio, psycho, and socio-culture factors basically influence development. Okay, that's biopsychosocial. What is a stigma? A stigma is basically a negative label given to people. Okay? It's stigma. Negative label that causes people to be regarded as different, defective, those are so mean, and just set apart from mainstream, set apart from society, from mainstream society. Okay? So what else? Okay, let's talk about the kind of what impact stigma has on people. Okay, so psychological disorders, they're inevitably associated with stigmas. That means that people regard those with psychological disorders as defective in a way. They're kind of like viewed as dismissed or like discarded by society, like you're not part of mainstream society, you know? And there's a range. Some people might be uncomfortable with somebody who has a psychological disorder, whereas some people may be outright prejudice. Okay? So basically it results in social discrimination, and it complicates the life of those with psychological disorders even more. People who are having symptoms of psychological disorders may not help themselves because they're so afraid of what people think about mental illness. They're so afraid of social stigmas. And you guys, that happened to me for a long time. And it's because we internalize the stigmas as well. And some individuals are able to resist the stigma, but some are not, okay? So let's move on. What is spiritual versus humanitarian versus all that stuff? Basically, for a long time, people have come up with their own explanations to psychological disorders. For example, spiritual explanations regarding abnormal behavior as like being possessed by evil or demonic spirits, okay? Humanitarian explanations. So humanitarian explanations are those that regard psychological disorders as the result of cruelty or stress or poor living conditions. Like, okay, this person's a victim and they were made this way because, you know, of these horrible things that happened to them. But the scientific explanation, okay, looks for causes that we can objectively measure, such as biological measurements, faulty learning processes, or emotional stressors. We'll follow these trajectories throughout history. Each of them will have had its period of major influence, but in some ways the issues are the same today as in the ancient times, in that the actual causes of psychological disorders remain unknown. The scientific approach will undoubtedly provide the key to discovering what causes psychological disorders, but it will nevertheless be important for mental health professionals to follow the principles of the humanitarian approach. Spiritual explanations may never completely disappear from the horizon, but the idea that psychological disorders can be understood will certainly provide the best prospects for turning that understanding into treatment. So let's begin with the oldest approach to psychology. So there are 3 psychological approaches, okay? 3 psychological approaches in history. Spiritual, humanitarian, scientific. Okay, so let's begin with the oldest approach to psychological disorders. So dating back to prehistoric times, Archaeological evidence from about 8,000 BCE suggests that the spiritual explanation of psychological disorders was most widely accepted. So this is part of our humanity, you guys, psychological disorders. Skulls discovered in caves inhabited by prehistoric people showed signs of trephining, in which holes were cut into the bones. Archaeologists have found trephined skulls from many countries and cultures around the world, many of which reveal a surprising degree of medical expertise. We're talking 8,000 BC, okay? Like literally prehistoric times. Trephining continued to be practiced throughout history and even into modern times, but its use during ancient times seems to be specifically associated with beliefs that the individual experiencing psychological symptoms was possessed by evil spirits. A second manifestation of belief in spiritual possession as the cause of psychological disorders is the ritual of exorcism. In this practice, a shaman, a priest, or a person entrusted with the task, such as, medicine man, carries out rituals that put the individual under extreme physical and mental duress in an effort to drive out the devil. Exorcism continues to exist into this present day. For example, Vietnamese people with psychological symptoms are reported to seek exorcism and spirit calling as forms of healing at Buddhist temples. During the Middle Ages, people used a variety of magical rituals to, quote, cure people with psychological disorders. But this treatment also took the form of casting these individuals as sinners, witches, or personifications of the devil. This topic is just like right in time for Halloween. Accordingly, victims were severely punished. The view of afflicted individuals as possessed by evil spirits is apparent in the 1486 book Malleus Maleficarum, in which two German Dominican monks, justified their harsh punishment of witches, depicting them as heretics and devils whom the church had to destroy in the interest of preserving Christianity. The book's authors recommended treatments such as deportation, torture, and burning at the stake. We are so lucky we were born right now. From the 1500s to the late 1600s, the majority of individuals accused of witchcraft were women. The burning and hanging of witches by the Puritans in the United States eventually ended after the infamous Salem witchcraft trials, when townspeople began to doubt the authenticity of the charges against these women. Remnants of the oppression of women who practice indigenous methods of healing remain today in both Western and non-Western cultures. Although the spiritual approach is no longer the prevalent explanation for psychological disorders in the Western culture, there are still pockets of believers who feel with these disorders require spiritual cleansing. Across other cultures, those who enact the role of exorcists continue to practice, reflecting long-standing cultural and religious beliefs. Okay, so another approach to psychological disorders throughout history has been the humanitarian approach. The humanitarian approach to psychological disorders developed in part as a reaction against the spiritual approach and its associated punishment of people with psychological disorders. The roots of the humanitarian approach can be traced to the Middle Ages, with the establishment of shelters to house these individuals, who often were ostracized by their families. The shelters were typically located within poorhouses and monasteries. Thank you, Nayeli. Although shelters could not offer treatment, they initially provided some protection from a harsh outside world. Aww. However, they increasingly became overcrowded and conditions within grew intolerable. Rather than providing protection, shelters became places of neglect, abuse, and maltreatment. So this is how people treated or approached psychological disorders, okay, in the Middle Ages. There was a widespread belief that people with psychological disorders lacked ordinary sensory capabilities, and that led to such practices as not providing them with heat, clean living conditions, or appropriate food. Babe, would you mind getting me the white blanket?
Where?
On the chair over there. During the 16th and 17th centuries, views about medicine were generally uninformed. Thus, like treatments for physical illnesses, the treatment of people, thank you, my love. The treatment of people with psychological disorders included bleeding, forced vomiting, and purging. However, with the newer sciences developing in the Renaissance, therapeutic healing based on compassionate support began to emerge. So witch burning was a common practice in the 16th century German. Basically, if you had a psychological disorder in the Middle Ages, you were spooked. Okay? Well, not in the Middle Ages, but before that. In the Middle Ages, like, at least you had somewhere to live, right? Anyway, continuing with the humanitarian approach to psychological disorders. By the end of the 18th century, the humanitarian approach gained farther strength as a few courageous people began working in hospitals in France, Scotland, and England. By the end of the 18th century, the humanitarian approach gained further strength as a few courageous people working in hospitals in France, Scotland, and England began to recognize the inhumanity of the conditions in the poorhouses and monasteries housing those with psychological disorders. Okay, bye.